The thrill of victory, the roar of the crowd, athletes from around the world chasing Olympic glory on snow and ice. For a century, the Winter Olympics have delivered some of sport's most iconic moments. Soaring ski jumps, lightning-fast bobsled runs, breathtaking figure skating. But those moments depend on one thing: cold weather. When the Winter Games first came to Cortina in 1956, February temperatures averaged 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Natural snow covered the mountains, ice stayed frozen. This year, the Olympics returned to Cortina, but the town is now more than 6 degrees warmer. It sees 41 fewer freezing days each year. And the 2026 Games will rely on more than 3 million cubic yards of artificial snow. In fact, every city that has hosted the Winter Olympics since 1950 is warmer today than it was when the Games arrived. This week, we're going off the radar to examine new research mapping which cities can still host the Winter Olympics in a warming world. That list is shrinking fast, and what happens next may decide whether the Winter Olympics remain possible at all. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracey, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. The 2026 Winter Olympics kick off this month in northern Italy, but as excitement builds for the Games, there's a troubling question hanging over the future of winter sports. How much longer can we keep doing this? This week, we're talking with Dr. Daniel Scott, a professor at the University of Waterloo, who has published groundbreaking research on climate change and winter sports. His findings are stark. By the 2050s, only about half of the 93 potential host cities will have conditions reliable enough for safe, fair competition. For the Paralympic Games, held a month later in warmer March temperatures, just 22 sites worldwide will remain viable. Dr. Scott will share why warmer conditions aren't just an inconvenience, they create real dangers for the athletes. Dr. Daniel Scott, we are talking about the Olympics today and climate change, a lot of great information that you have recently released, and I can't wait to hear all about it. But I want to also get a little background on the Olympics, because I think we all know about the Olympics, but we don't maybe know the history, how long they've been going on. And I remember when I was a kid, it shifted too. It was no longer summer and winter games in the same year, and it shifted over to now it's separated out. So do you have a little insider info here on where they've been held historically?
Yeah, so the Winter Olympics just got into its second century. So I think the first one was in 1924. So we're now just into the second century. The earliest games, the fun part of looking back at the original pictures is everything was outside. So your hockey, your figure skating, your curling all had to be out on ice surfaces on nearby lakes and things like that. The original sort of bobsled and luge tracks are kind of almost comical to look at, how it's 10 kids out in the backyard built this thing with icy snowbanks, etc. But those were all, there was no concrete or other kind of structured track. And then the snow sports were, you got what Mother Nature gave you. The first snowmaking came into effect, I think it was Lake Placid Games, so the 1980s.
Wow.
So snowmaking's been around for, 30, 40 years. The hockey and all that kind of things were moved indoors in the sort of 50s and 60s. But all of those have been sort of put in place to try to reduce the weather risk, because whether it's not enough snow or way too much snow, when you had snow falling on those outdoor surfaces, that interrupted games and things like that too. So it's always been part of the games. They've just tried to manage it as best as they could, even without climate change.
Yeah, so I can imagine that the carbon footprint of the Olympic Games has changed significantly over the years then.
Yeah, and that's only been, something of consideration for the IOC. They added sustainability, where the environment is sort of a third pillar about 25 years ago, where they've really started to pay more attention to that, both for the Winter Games and the Summer Games. But as part of that work, they've really, at least for the Winter Games, started looking at what areas, what potential hosts already have all, if not most of the sports infrastructure in place, so that you don't have to build new. There's a big carbon footprint associated with stadiums and all that kind of thing. The operational part, as you said, is really important too. But if you can avoid building a whole bunch of new things, you actually reduce the carbon footprint at the start. You're still going to have the operations and the transport and getting, tens of thousands of athletes and coaches and officials to the games is a big part of it. And then obviously the spectators as well.
Do you have any insider info on kind of the process of choosing locations and, what they're looking for in addition to the things you just said, but what else they're looking for and what ultimately decides where these are going to be and how far in advance they're chosen?
So I can answer the last bit quickly. That next couple of winter games they've chosen already, which was kind of rare. They actually chose the next two. Usually they're awarded about 8 years before you actually host it to give you time to do all the organization, build what you need to build, etc. And even still, we see this, in Italy, in Cortina, in Milano, the hockey arena literally was being finished up like a couple of weeks ago, and the first test games, that soon to the game. So, in terms of how hosts are chosen, that's a black box that everybody would love to know how. Ultimately, it's a vote. So all of the IOC member states do vote on those things. So different bids come in and they do vote. We've really sort of worked well with the International Olympic Committee in terms of getting them to put more emphasis on climate reliability. And we think that's really important for the fairness of the games, but even the safety. We saw from Vancouver to the Sochi Games, the injury rate for the Paralympians in snow sports went up 6 times. So it wasn't just that these were unfair. Some of these athletes who have trained their whole lives for this were paying the price, with their health, their bodies in some cases. So that's been good. They've actually built the, climate reliability as one of their criteria. But they have an unenviable job. The politics, the economics, all the rest of it comes into play, which we have no sense of, how that plays out. Something like the Sochi Games, which is partly why we got into this work on climate change, made no sense climatologically. It's not like Russia's short on cold places to hold a Winter Olympics and you pick. It's like putting the Winter Olympics in Nashville in the US. You just wouldn't do that. So that didn't make any sense. So that's where the politics and whatever else is going on behind the scenes comes into place in a bid like that. But the next couple, we've got Cortina this in a couple of weeks. We've got the French Alps after that, highly climate reliable. And then back to Salt Lake City, the Utah bid. So the next couple are in sort of traditional winter powerhouse locations. Where winter sports are a big part of but not just the economy, but the culture of those places.
All right. So you've done a couple of studies now on this, one very recently and then one a little while back. Did they focus only on Winter Olympics?
Yeah. So the work we've done with the International Olympic Committee has been focused on the Winter Olympics and getting that climate reliability. There, of course, is climate related or climate change related concerns related to the summer games, particularly the last couple. You've seen extreme heat, both in Japan, but Paris, even London before that, having to shift the marathon to them starting at midnight and in a different place and those sort of things. So those are certainly in play for the Summer Olympics. The Summer Olympics has more adaptive options. So the Brisbane Games will be in their winter, so it will reduce the temperatures because it's in the southern hemisphere. You can also go back to the shoulder seasons, like the original Paris Games was in April. You avoided that summer heat of July and August. It's only been the sort of last 30 or so years that it's always been 40 years, always been in those summer months. And in part, that's largely due to media rights. They don't want it moved out of that summer. That's a good time to get the eyeballs and the viewership up. That could change. The climate might drive that. But our work's just focused on the winter.
Okay, so let's go back to the first study you did. What did that look at?
We had seen Vancouver had a bit of struggles when El Nino showed up at the wrong time. Sochi was coming up next. So we said, well, hey, let's look at how the climate has actually changed since the start of the games, nearly 100 years ago at that time. And what does the future look like? Can all of these past 21 hosts reliably host the games under different climate change scenarios? So that's where we started. And of those 21 hosts by mid-century, you were getting down to about 12 to 14, again, depending on whether we achieve the Paris Climate Agreement, which looks less and less likely year over year, or you continue down sort of a current policy, higher emission type of pathway. And that was for the Olympics in February. The results for the Paralympics, which are held in March, are just that much closer to the spring, are much worse. And so that was the work that caught the attention of the International Olympic Committee. So they invited us in to do a presentation to their future host committee. A couple of weeks after that, they put a pause on the selection of the next host. And then they said in that press release, they were referring to some of our work, which was great to see. So that's where it started. And then they came back to us and said, hey, we've got 93 locations around the world where the games could potentially be hosted. Can you take a look at these 93 locations instead of just the 21 places that have had the games before? And the good news coming out of that was we were up to about 45 to 55 potential hosts in mid-century instead of just the 12 or 14. So we started with a much bigger pool. We ended up with a lot more options, which was great to see.
Okay. So how did you look at this information? Like, what was the process?
Yeah, so we started with a bunch of different potential indicators, but we're just looking at the snow sports. Obviously, the hockey and everything else that's indoors, that's weatherproof. So that's you can host that in Miami if you wanted. We're looking at the snow sports, and so the two criteria we kept at the end of the day was one, can you either Mother Nature gives you the snowpack, or you can make the snowpack for a February 1 start for the Olympics. So we go back about a month, sort of starting January 1st. What does the weather look like? What kind of natural snow is coming? And then how many days of snowmaking do you have in there so that you can have a snowpack of about, IOC prefers about 50 centimeters as a snow base. Can you produce that, which is important? And then we look at the temperatures during the games as well, because what we saw in Sochi was, yes, they made the snowpack. The snowpack was there, but it was so warm. It was like skiing in a slushy, hard. It was getting carved up. People weren't hitting jumps at the right speed. They weren't getting to landing areas, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the two types of things. One, can you make the snowpack? And then do you get the cold temperatures during the games that you can maintain that snowpack? Or if you get warm temperatures above freezing during the day, do you get colder temperatures at night so you can do the grooming, repair the courses, and have a good safe competition surface for the athletes?
And then this second study really looked at like solutions, not just as far as locations, but like sustainability solutions as well, right?
Yeah, we sort of listed out a whole range of options to improve the climate resilience of the game. Different options. You can go to higher altitudes. You can select your locations strategically, as the IOC is starting to do. But one of the important ones we looked at, we've heard, and this was a big criticism in Beijing, relying on pretty much 100% machine-made snow, which was known going in. It's their dry season, so there was no option. Mother Nature was not going to give you loads of snow like they might in other locations. So, but there was a lot of criticisms of that and sort of the sustainability of snowmaking. And some were posing questions. Why don't we just go to places where we don't need snowmaking? And the answer to that is there aren't any. There's about 4 locations by mid-century that you could say would be climate reliable with just a natural snowpack. That's part of the work, the modeling that we do. But there's very few.
What are the locations? Can you name off a couple?
One's in Japan, one's in Russia that has not hosted the games before, but could. And then there's 2 in France, near where the French Alps Games will be held in 4 years. So those were the sort of four that are left, and some of those are higher elevation too. Like, and you can go even further higher elevation, but then you start getting into elevation sickness for athletes. So it's a fine. Well, it's a fine line. You get the snow.
Everest.
Yeah, exactly. You can't be holding the Olympics at elevate. I mean, even when you go to Denver, Colorado resorts, athletes have to go there and train in high elevation for a period of time to get used to that, right? Let alone going to even higher elevation. So that was part of what we looked at. And then in the sustainability of that snowmaking can be unsustainable, but can be very sustainable if you do it well. We looked at some comparisons there. And then the other big thing that we looked at this go around was, how do you solve for the Paralympics? Because they're the ones that are much more at risk. And so that you could merge the Paralympics in with the Olympics, but that makes the games so much bigger. They're already too big for an Innsbruck or a Lillehammer to handle now. It would make them that much bigger, and probably fewer cities would bid for it, because now it's even a bigger task to try to host. So that doesn't really work well. You could go back to the way it was, where the Paralympics was held in a different location from the Olympics, but that goes against the one bid, one city partnership that they've had for the last 20 to 30 years. I think most people want to see that maintained. So then we looked at, well, what if you move the Olympics and the Paralympics forward in time by about 3 weeks? So the Olympics would start sort of mid-January instead of into February. That would allow the Paralympics to come up and start the last week of February and sort of finish up the first week of March. So end of February or early March. And that made a huge difference for the Paralympics. It almost doubled the number of climate reliable locations by mid-century. So that was a really good finding. And it turns out that's something the IOC has actually been contemplating, shifting that schedule around, whether it was 3 weeks or 2 weeks. But there has been a quote from the head of the Future Host Committee, Carl Stoss, they've looked at that. So we're going to put some numbers to that for them. We haven't shared it with them just yet, but we put some numbers, which hopefully they'll appreciate that good news.
The media will not, though. They don't want to air anything in January. Okay, well, what else did you find from this most recent research? Is there anything else maybe surprising that came out of it that you're recommending to the committee?
Well, I think the other important point that we wanted to help them make, again, because there's been so much pushback on snowmaking, is that you can't host the games without it. That's just not possible, and you only need to use the snowmaking as much as you need to. If Mother Nature gives you so much snow, you don't need it, great, but it's always there as a backup, and it is used depending on the location to different extents. We made that point at trying to take away snowmaking from the Olympics. It makes about as much sense as moving hockey back outside. You just wouldn't do that. You've got this technology. So the point is, how do you make it as sustainable as possible? The same way you want your hockey arena or your figure skating arena to be as sustainable as possible. And that is, how that is so place specific. We looked at water use in the next couple of games, as well as the energy and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. And that's an important one. We compared Italy, the French Alps in Salt Lake City, and for the same unit of snowmaking, the French Alps is almost no carbon footprint because their electricity grid is entirely nuclear. So there's no carbon associated with that, whereas Italy's still got a bit of a mix of different fossil fuels, so it's about 6 times what you would for the same unit of snow. And then Salt Lake City, because they still have coal in their grid, is 16 times what it is in France. So even amongst those three, you can see how different and how important it is to try to figure out, well, okay, how do we get that snowmaking? But the rest of the games as well on a more low carbon electricity grid.
Did you talk to any athletes during this?
Another study that we did during the Beijing Games was actually involved a survey of a couple hundred coaches and professional athletes, former Olympians, mostly from North America and Europe. 95% of them share a concern about the future of their sport. They look at their training grounds for summer training, how those have changed. They look at competitions that have been traditionally held at certain times, how much more frequently those are being canceled or postponed, or the types of conditions. So, and then they look at, where they learn to ski or whatever the case is, and those local ski hills, if they're closed or are struggling, that's not just the pipeline of recreational skiers that eventually go and ski at the bigger places, but that's also where the elite athlete pipeline starts. And if you don't have that option close to home, your kids get into something else. They play soccer, football, they pick up hoops or gymnastics, whatever the thing is, but you end up with a lot less people in that elite athlete pipeline.
Do you think in the future you will study summer games?
We had started to look at the heat question, and we did some early analysis on that, where you could go and because that's the primary threat to athlete health, but also spectators and coaches. I mean, you've seen even officials pass out during not just the Olympics, but professional tennis and many other sorts of things. So it is a danger. Certainly that the IOC and pretty much every professional or the NCAA in the States, they have real important protocols for summer training for football and other sorts of sports. So that's come a long way in the last probably 5 to 10 years in terms of awareness of heat stress on athletes, but also viewers. And just because you've got so many options in terms of, again, they've got to balance that with media rights and everything else. When are people going to want to watch? Can you go into the fall seasons or spring? Flipping over to the Southern Hemisphere is great, but you can only do that so often. The Brisbane Games should be like perfect temperatures, hopefully. But again, you can't have all of your summer games down in the Southern Hemisphere.
Anything else that you can think of about the future of the games and what you see like 50 years down the road?
One of the biggest, points we try to emphasize, in addition to we've got to solve for the Paralympics climate risk in the near term, but I think by the time the 2038 Games is awarded, they need to have a solution, whatever that's going to be. But the other big sort of point, mid-century and certainly beyond that, is you really end up in two different futures broadly for sport, but certainly for the Winter Games, where, if the world is able to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement, yes, we see a few more lost potential host locations, but it kind of stabilizes thereafter. So the 2050s look a lot like the same in the 2080s. So that's the future we hope we end up in, and winter sports remains very recognizable for multiple generations. And their high emission future, it's very different. And that's, we want to avoid that future for agricultural and food supply and many other reasons. But sport is just one more reason to try to emphasize trying to achieve that Paris Climate Agreement. And the ski industry and sports and the IOC has made real promises in terms of, I think as of 2030, all the hosts are contractually obligated to be climate neutral, I think they call it, to track their emissions, try to reduce them as much as possible, and then offset what they have left. So that's a big part of the games going forward as well.
So what we do right now does make a huge difference.
For sure. We're going to pay the bill, so to speak. Less so us, but with the next generation and the generation of thereafter. So absolutely.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes published every Tuesday. Thank you so much to Dr. Daniel Scott for sharing his research with us today. Also, thanks to Climate Central for some of the data you heard at the beginning of this episode. Thanks to the National Weather Desk and Sinclair Broadcast Group for their ongoing support of the podcast, and to my associate producer, Brian Petras, for his help with today's episode. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracey. Make it a great day.